welcome. Tavia Nyong'O is a professor of African American Studies and Theater Studies at Yale University, where he teaches courses on aesthetic and affect theory, performativity, cultural studies and cultural history, and Black and queer studies. His research and teaching interests include the cultural study of performance, 19th and 20th century American studies, Black studies, Marxism and psychoanalysis, queer and feminist theory, popular music studies, and poetics. His first book, The Amalgamation Waltz, Race, Performance, and the Ruses of Memory, published by University of Minnesota Press in 2009, won the Errol Hill Award for Best Book in African American Theater and Performance Studies. Woohoo! Yep. His study of fabulation in contemporary Black art and performance is forthcoming from NYU Press later this year. Nyong'O co-edits the journal Social Text, published by Duke University Press, and is also a co-series editor of the Sexual Cultures book series at NYU Press with Anne Pellegrini and Joshua Chambers-Flexen from Northwestern. So he's here. Please join me in welcoming Tavia Nyong'O.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and thanks also to Nal Bustamante and to Marcus Quilon and Nura Liddell for all facilitating my visit here today, and thank you all for coming. I am going to be speaking from the book that was just referenced, the title Afrofabulations on the Queer Drama of Black Life, which is forthcoming from NYU Press in October, November, depending on how quickly I answer my editor's emails. But one way or another, it should be out before the end of the year. And what I want to do today is give you a kind of overview of the concerns and arguments of that book. Oh yeah, I was just going to ask, thank you, you read my mind, we turn the lights down. Some overview of the argument and read a kind of condensed version of the first chapter. So without further ado, I'll jump into it. I hope my voice projects. I've been instructed by Dr. Vaginal Davis to always speak from the diaphragm. Hopefully I will continue to do so over the course of the day. Okay. The performance begins while the audience is still waiting for it, in media res. The performer is moving through the crowd, greeting arriving guests and fussing with arrangements like a good host. The audience is seated on the stage of this 100-year-old proscenium theater, located in a working-class district in downtown New York City. Yes, there are still working-class districts in downtown New York City. We, the audience, are arranged around a catwalk like we were expecting a fashion show. There is no backstage, just a rack of clothes off to one side. Just before showtime, the dancer choreographer personally moves two guests of honor, an important curator and her +1, from their temporary perches off to one side to special reserved seating front and center. And if I were more prepared, I would sort of at this point grab someone from the front and put them in the front here. So we won't do that. Just like at a fashion show, front row is part of the show. With this final adjustment, this audience is seated, and the latest performance of Tragil Harrell's solo dance piece, 20 Looks, there's the curator now, or Paris is Burning at the Judson Church, size small, can begin. The performance has not yet begun, even though it somehow has. All eyes are now on Harrell, who has just casually changed in front of us into the first of an expected 20 looks. West Coast preppy schoolboy. You can tell me, you be the judge, right? I'm here on the West Coast. The house lights are still up, but no curtain has been raised, and there is no other ritualized indication that we've crossed over from real life into performance. Harrell hasn't even moved onto the catwalk. He stands aside the runway rather than walking down it. The mood hasn't shifted from one of quiet anticipation. There is no frantic audience applause, no pumping music, no flash of the cameras. No fierce poses, just the almost blank stare with which Harrell breaks the fourth wall as he stands there insouciantly in his flip-flops, looking at us. For those in the audience familiar either with the world of haute couture, with the ballroom houses that have stylized a queer, Black, and Latinx counterpublic version of the haute couture world, or with both, this solo dance piece feels like an abstraction, even a subtraction. Audience handouts explain the quotidian anti-spectacular note on which the show starts by referencing the tradition of postmodern dance it aims to hybridize with the movement vocabulary of catwalk and voguing. The distinctive strands and threads of postmodernism have become tangled up until the point where the term now seems ironically to reference not the present or future, but the quickly receding past. And just as an aside, one of the looks that he gives, not the one we're looking at right now, is like old school postmodern, and the kind of joke for me at the time was, it was basically what I was wearing in the audience when I saw it. Old school postmodern. 20 looks toys with the rhyme it spies between the cycle of fashion and clothing and theory. Let me try that again. 20 looks toys with the rhyme that it espies between the cycle of fashion in clothing and theory, subjecting both to sartorial citation and light satire. By the time Harold completes his 20 looks, all the expected elements of a fashion show have eventually appeared, but in a deconstructed and syncopated manner. Now, if Black survival in an anti-Black world often feels like a race against time, in my book I look to modes of memory and imagination, the modes of memory and imagination through which a Black polytemporality is invented and sustained. Angular sociality, as I will describe it in this talk, names the gait and rhythm of Black social life as it moves in and out of step with itself. I mean angularity as Zora Neale Hurston defined the word in her classic essay on Black expressive culture. There she spoke of this angularity as a will to adorn, a will to stand out, and a will, in parlance I borrowed in part from Kara Keeling, to trans-individuate, right? Which is different from, as we shall see, a possessive individualism of neoliberal culture. We see such angular poses in looks 12 and 13 from the show, variations on the category legendary face, poses that take me back to the one time I had the privilege of seeing the legendary Octavia Saint Laurent walk a ball. And now, here was Trajol in large yellow sunglasses, hiding from non-existent paparazzi, almost cringing at the recorded clop, clop of stiletto heels coming out of the speakers. The dancer raises his arms before his face, and his hands give off the pronounced, tremulous hauteur of a grande dame. She is aged, a crone. Without the instant verdict of a panel of judges or the chanting of an opinionated crowd, Harold can retreat into a languorous, interiorized vogue during his penultimate look, legendary with a twist. We are transported back to Sunset Boulevard, and those who remember can hear Norma Desmond lament how she was still big. It was the pictures that got small. Channeling the diva is a recognized queer move, and Joshua Chambers Letson has written in illuminating ways about the ways in which Kazuo Ono's style of Buto influenced subsequent dancers like Aiko, and indeed, as I'll talk today, Trajol Harold, through its emphasis on memory of the womb and the female generative experience. What interests me in particular about Harold's crone and other diva performances is his mercurial capacity to toggle between affable ordinariness and haughty glamour, as if he were joking about both and, at the same time, incredibly serious. In the account of what I call critical shade in his work, I track this strategic mimesis of both the exceptional and spectacular performing body, the deep archives of what Francesca Royster has memorably termed the eccentric acts of Black performance, and a counter-mimetic invasion of the positionality of the spectator. Highly cognizant of the debates around performative agency and spectatorial exploitation that have been raging since the 90s, Harold develops new performative and choreographic techniques for performing both for and against the camera. We can think of these strategies, I want to suggest today, as critical shade. I begin with 20 looks because of the questions it helps distill about the project Harold has been working on for the greater part of a decade, coincidentally also the decade during which I have been writing this book. Like Harold, I have been fascinated with the problem of history and memory in performance, a medium that is supposedly tethered to the here and now, but which longs for what Jose Esteban Munoz called the there and then. 20 Looks is in some respects a choreographic response to these critical debates, at once a reading of them, as in an engagement, and a read of them, in the black queer vernacular sense of throwing shade. I have to say, like, we can talk about this in the conversation, but like, read and like throwing shade, I have always thought of as black queer vernacular. Apparently that's changing, and I want to know whether you think about that, like it's no longer so associated specifically with blackness. There's like a very strange podcast called Throwing Shade that features no black people in it, but so I may have to revise the sentence, but or throw shade at that podcast. So in the black queer vernacular sense of throwing shade, by magnifying and parodying certain flaws and idiosyncrasies magnifying and parodying certain flaws or idiosyncrasies in an opponent or rival. This use of shade raises a series of questions. If in 20 Looks, Harold performs as a screen upon which images of Hollywood glamour and underground queer black fierceness can alike dance and settle, in what ways might this work for the concert stage corroborate, and in what ways complicate the cultural contradictions that gave rise to voguing in the first place? Voguing, as an underground dance form, reflected back in both homage and hyperbolic parody the world of whiteness, wealth, and privilege that has become Harold's milieu. We can also, of course, think about the prominent role Japan has long held in the world of avant-garde fashion, and the degree to which choreographers like Ono and designers like Rei Kawakubo have influenced both the ballroom culture and the choreography of Harold. Think of a figure like Willie Ninja, right, in Paris is Burning, right? The Japanese post-war avant-garde complicates the whiteness of wealth that earlier critics like Peggy Phelan and Bell Hooks emphasized, while introducing a new problematic along an Afro-Asian axis. Madison Moore goes into much more detail on this question in his forthcoming book, The Theory of the Fabulous Class. Given that Harold is actually performing in the avant-garde milieu that was once the stuff of voguing fantasy, can we say that the gap between reality and appearance that once marked the frisson of voguing has been dissolved? Conversely, when a competitive black social dance form is sublimated into solo concert dance, presented to curators, presenters, and tastemakers, does it change in nature? What does it mean to deliver Vogue into a space, but as an absent presence, a withholding? And this, by the way, is just an image from Vogue Japan, circa 2012. Aware of the tensions aroused by the proposition the performance carried, the program for the evening, I'm returning to 20 Looks, included a quote from a well-known essay about voguing written by performance theorist Peggy Phelan. I won't read the whole quote, I'll just put it up there. I'm talking about this also kind of like it's up an archival object, I guess, now. The program note would invite the alert reader to ponder these words, especially this performance enacting the let me read it properly. The performances then enact simultaneously the desire to eliminate the distance between ontology and performance and the reaffirmation of that distance. The program note would invite the alert reader to ponder these words, which were first published in 1993, in the historical perspective made possible by reading them in 2017, at a moment in which, at least for a certain orangish tint of whiteness, ontology has indeed caught up with performance, and to look like a business executive or a president is to be a business executive or a president. Is there perhaps then a certain amount of shade implied in Harold's granting Phelan's critical analysis of the ball's first, last, and only interpretive word on the mode and meaning of this angular and oppositional art form? There is indeed something old school postmodern about the confident contrast between performance and ontology in this passage, a perhaps old-fashioned affirmation of a distance that has in fact unexpectedly collapsed. And yet, returning to Phelan's subtle critique of the performative efficacy of the ball world in the context of present-day critical debates over Afro-pessimism, for instance, would suggest the predicament she notates here isn't necessarily superseded. Performance, Phelan suggests in Harold's citation of her, is not the same thing as agency, even if the malevolent agencies of our world come draped in their own particular theater. The implicit pessimism in this excerpt can be gleaned from the distance between ontology and performance that Phelan affirms for the black queer performing subject in particular. After all, for all too many black people, even actually being a business executive, scholar, or president is not enough for us to appear like one, right? At least not in the eyes of many fellow citizens. A black person in a position of authority can always be suspected, whether openly or covertly, of merely posing as that particular position. The passage Harrell selects for contemporary recirculation thus contains a crucial ambiguity. Has Phelan missed the crucial ontological difference that blackness introduces into the theatricality of everyday life, or has she insisted upon it? In her recent lecture on the work of Jose Munoz, the scholar Judith Butler has given us a more robust sense of the ontology of performance, or perhaps we should now think of it as an axiology of performance, insofar as we are now talking less of the theory of being than we are of a theory of value, axiology being the theory of value. In recounting her own experience of being the target of a queer fabulation, Butler argues that although fabulation was, quote, a fiction, and though one could call it a lie, that would deflect from its primary importance as a way of staging hyper-communicability and the occasion for confabulating, stoking a pleasure unburdened by the claim of referential truth, unquote. I would assert, however, that the pleasure of fabulation, shade, gossip, and trismeria lie less in being unburdened by standards of verdiction, as Butler argues, so much as in a live and agonistic transvaluation of that standard of truth. If we recall Hartman's important work, Saidiya Hartman's important work on the production of the truth of blackness in US courtrooms, going back to the 19th century, a period in which a black subject could confess to and be guilty of a crime, but could not give witness or testimony against someone else, we can see how referential truth has always been burdened by its racial unconscious. The aggressive and asymmetric play of critical shade responds to the state of affairs from which fabulation is often a matter of survival. One reason we cannot fully ascertain the tone of Harrell's citation of Phelan, to return to the prior citation, I would argue is because, at least in this performance, he has chosen not to perform fully within the matrix of voguing. That is to say, he doesn't invite his audience to appraise him as directly fulfilling or transcending Phelan's pessimistic equation. Instead of Vogue, it is the possibility of Vogue that dances around his 20 looks, dances that work collectively as a set of appearances to impoverish the hyperbolic expectations that now routinely accompany the appearance of blackness and queerness in dance and theatrical contexts. Of course, voguing does appear at various points and through a range of performers over the course of 20 looks, but it almost never appears on demand or on cue, and thus it remains difficult or impossible for the viewer to disentangle Vogue from postmodern dance, or, for that matter, from any of the other performance genres that Harrell draws from. In drawing from Vogue as a performative resource rather than exhibiting it as the expressive essence of black queer embodiment, Harrell adopts an analytic and even spectatorial relationship to the form that preempts any simple identification of him as a quote-unquote voguer. Harrell routinely breaks the fourth wall in his performances, sitting in the audience, talking, and even sleeping. It's great, right? I think it's fun to sleep at your own performance. If one would fall asleep here, that would be the spirit of Harrell's work, I think. If old school postmodern presented a look that suggested that he could be in his audience as readily as on his stage, these performative tactics dissimulate from the virtuosity expected of black queer performing bodies. Harrell experiments with a kind of reversal of audience participation by suggesting that he himself is ready to become his own audience. The public staging of his rehearsal process as part of a residency at MoMA intensified this Hall of Mirrors effect, as an audience stood behind a velvet rope looking into the atrium at Harrell looking at his own dancers improvise. I'm sorry, I wish I had a slide of that, actually it's quite a clever image. While the staging of the rehearsal process was in itself highly theatrical, in that Harrell ordinarily does not allow anyone not directly involved in a piece into his studio, the artificiality of the scenario underscored the paradoxical degree to which Harrell manages to be at once inside and outside of his performances, disrupting the evaluative and objectifying gaze critics might seek to direct towards them. The irony of Harrell's project, of course, is that voguing continues to circulate internationally as a competitive social dance form, associated primarily, although not exclusively, with black and brown, queer, and transgender use. His own auteur choreographies in highly valorized venues like the Museum of Modern Art, New York Live Arts, and the Hebel am Ufer Theater in Berlin are all staged against the backdrop of this living repertoire, even as its actual participants, dancers and announcers, only occasionally cross over into his shows. And this is one of the questions about this project that is worth kind of getting into depending on who's in the audience, right? In this respect, Harrell inherits and updates a classic concern of minoritarian performance, one that Munoz, again, in his book Disidentifications, termed the burden of liveness. Responding to Phelan's famous claim that performance only lives in the now and becomes itself through disappearance, Munoz argued that such a definition tended to minimize the violence it does to those subjects denied history and civic standing, those for whom liveness can circulate as a fetish. Corroborating Munoz's insistence on attending to the ephemera and afterlives of performance, Chambers-Letzen argues that for minoritarian subjects, liveness is not merely an interesting scholarly aporia, but a performative imperative. If capitalism exploits and appropriates in order to produce surplus value or more worth, in Gayatri Spivak's provocative translation, then minoritarian performance, in Chambers-Letzen's view, generates more life. And just as ethnographers of contemporary ballroom performance like Marlon Bailey have shown that the Vogue scene has incorporated Jenny Livingston's film Paris is Burning into its own historical memory, so too does Harrell in 20 Looks incorporate the critical tradition that would make sense of his aesthetic, as indicated in the handout citation of Phelan's Unmarked and in his sardonic references to postmodernism as a style, reflecting the gaze back upon the critics and theorists who have sought to explicate and define the meanings that inhere in the dance. Harrell's back and forth between critic and choreographer is playful but pointed. At its limit, it suggests the interpretation itself is conditioned as much as performance is by the dialectic of ontology and performance. Shade as a vernacular method of active and aggressive interpretation of an unfair and unequal social order is a frequent resource in this counter-mimetic choreography. It is worth noting in this respect that Munoz explicates his concept of the burden of liveness at greatest length in his chapter on the topic of chusmeria, a term originating in Cuba and its diaspora that refers to people and behaviors that, quote unquote, refuse standards of bourgeois comportment. Just for fun, I added this slide, to the, this is Carmelita Tropicana, defining the term chusma for us, right? Chusma, Munoz notes, operates as a barely veiled racial slur, suggesting that one is too black. Contemporary Anglophone cognates for chusma might include ghetto, cunty, or ratchet. And just to make sense, this is not the exact performance, but Carmelita Tropicana and Ella Troiano a couple weeks back and in Riverside gave a performance as part of Mundos Alternos, and Tropicana came out on stage, sort of came out into the audience, sort of in media race, and sort of asking people if they too, like her, came from a shithole country, right? And so like the ontology and axiology of being from a shithole country, right, might be a productive site for thinking blackness and brownness together in these times, right? These associations underscore a potential relation between chusma and shade. The dilemma of visibility for the race, class, gender, non-conforming chusma, Munoz notes, is that live performance for an audience of elites is the only imaginable mode of survival for minoritarian subjects within the hegemonic order that the chusma live within and in opposition to, unquote. The queer of color performer, Munoz rightly notes, is often singing for her supper or dancing because her feet are being shot at. While queer of color performativity is often equated with social agency both by its advocates and critics, here Munoz issues a sharp qualification to the celebratory pre-critical aura surrounding live performance. Let's go back to that quote there. He instead casts disidentification as a specifically minor practice in the sense with which Deleuze and Guattari describe a minor literature. A minor literature doesn't come from a minor language, they specify. It is rather that which a minority constructs within a major language. What Deleuze What Deleuze and Guattari argue that the minor writing of Kafka does within and in opposition to German literature, I maintain that Harrell does within and in opposition to postmodern dance. Rather than enliven the modernist tradition with the spirit of Black dance, from which it has all along drawn renewal in the mode of primitivism, Harrell, I claim, constructs a vantage point from which to peer into that tradition, reflecting back its gaze and dancing around, rather than simply dancing, the energetic tropes of fierce and virtuosic performance. It is an indication rather than an embodiment of presence. It holds something in reserve. For Munoz, the burden of liveness was a concept that helped performance theory account for and critique the way in which queer, transgender, and racialized bodies are so often exceptionalized through temporary displays of liveness in the very institutions that reject them as permanent occupants or stakeholders. And not to call out MoMA or anything, but it's pretty hilarious that the first ever performance residency at the museum had to perform A, in a hallway, and B, in a stairwell. And especially those who are performers or dancers, it's sort of no attention whatsoever given to the sort of basic conditions that you might want to perform in as a dancer. But so exceptionalized through temporary display, to be alive, live, or lively, however curious this claim seems, can itself be a burden, if through that presence one is denied a connection to history or the future. In the Marxist terms Munoz worked with, we could say the burden of liveness stages a minoritarian living labor that dialectically confronts the abstract labor represented by institutional capital. This confrontation between the living labor of the performing Black body and the demands of the institutions that seek to valorize themselves through that encounter is a major theme in contemporary Black art history. In a recent study of site-specific installations done by 4 Black artists in the 1990s, Huey Copeland has built upon Munoz's critique of the burden of liveness, locating it within the specificity of that he has shown Black artists to consider, a very garbled sentence, locating within it the specificity of how Black artists have resisted in various ways the manner in which the Black body is bound to appear in the afterlife of slavery. Like the visual artist that Copeland studies, Harrell navigates the demand for performative availability through techniques of deferral, recycling, and subtle redirection. As a choreographer, he shares in the propensity to at least partially dematerialize the Black body within presentational environments that tend to engage in it as a vivacious surplus. At times, it is as if the dancer disappears into the ambiance of his own solo, reaffirming the distance between performance and performance. In 2009, when Churchill Harrell formulated the original proposition for the series of performances he collectively entitled 20 Looks or Paris is Burning at Judson Church, he named his choreographic process one of fictional archiving. In so doing, Harrell resists conceptualizing the archive as the exclusive preserve of credentialed experts and authorities, or even as something to which the repertoire can be contrasted, as Diana Taylor has influentially proposed. The archive, his performances index, is at once an expansive and a problematic space of encounter, loss, distortion, and reinvention. The ethics of this encounter are not given in the standard protocols of documentary evidence, but they are hardly for that reason wholly absent from the endeavor. Fictional archiving is an affective relation to archives. Harrell is literally moved by them. Through this process of fictional archiving, Harrell proposed to revisit the distance and proximity between the queer and transgender African-American Vogue ball worlds that have taken place uptown in Harlem since the early 20th century, and the predominantly white downtown avant-garde that emerged in the 1960s. At first blush, such a proposition sounds like a deliberate paradox. How can an archive be fictional as opposed to simply false? If we cannot rely upon at least the ideal of truth and verifiability, how can we think about an objective account of the past? In my study of fabulation, however, I am interested in taking up the wager behind Harrell's proposition seriously and following out the insight it may bear on the historiography of performance. if there is a basis of comparison between the procedures of fiction and those of history, as Harrell's notion of fictional archiving suggests, then how does such a comparison bear out across other sites of contemporary Black art and performance, with its burden of representing the unbearable, impossible, and/or traumatic histories? Is Black performance, given the quasi-fictive basis of the Blackness upon which it is posited, the ultimate site of such a social and aesthetic production of fictions? Alongside the burden to appear, is there not also a kind of burden to fictionalize or to fabulate? If there is, of what consequence might be this habeas ficta, if you will, have for the contemporary theory and practice of Black performance? As I ask a lot of questions I don't answer. I'm just setting up for a longer argument, right? I'll answer them in Q&A if you want. As Harrell staged iterations of his 20 Looks project in concert dance spaces across Europe and America, he created a counter-archive of possibilities for dance history in the process. Aside from generating a series of remarkable performances, 20 Looks placed a series of questions on the table. He repeatedly asked before each performance, and he would read out the text of the proposition before almost every performance I saw, and I saw over a dozen over as many years. What would have happened in 1963 if someone from the voguing ball scene in Harlem had come downtown to perform alongside the early postmoderns in Judson Church? So these are the early postmoderns in Judson Church. This is, I believe, The Mind is a Muscle by Von Rainer, thank you. In academic history, there's a recognized subfield of counterfactual history, where small or large variables are deliberately fabricated, and historians try to determine how this change would affect subsequent events. There's a TV series, The Man, and based on such counterfactual. It's also a popular genre. Historical fiction is also rife with such what-if scenarios. But it is performance that is perhaps the richest set of affordances for approaching such speculation. Harrell's particular approach to reworking the past began by positing a stark reversal of the established trajectory wherein, since the beginning of the 20th century, white people have traveled up to Harlem for a night out amidst what the poet Langston Hughes aptly termed the spectacles in color. In Harrell's counterfactual hypothesis, this well-known slumming narrative is turned on its head, and an itinerant voguer instead makes their way downtown. You can see him here literally pulling the strings, right? Fiercely sachets through the doors of the imposing Italianate church overlooking Washington Square Park, fearlessly rubs shoulders with the cognoscenti of postmodern dance, and then dances until dawn in the cradle of the downtown scene. Nothing like this precise story was ever reenacted in any of Harrell's pieces, of course, but it is its fable in the sense that Brecht gave that term fable, right? The basic story or drift behind a given play or performance. Much to the consternation of some literal-minded critics, the proposition didn't always determine the scope of the resultant dance scenarios. But that, I would suggest, was because the scope of the performance encompassed them. In co-creating a fictional archive around his own performances, Harrell was constantly thinking about how his looks would look, and thus performing in antagonistic cooperation with the process by which dance history gets written. As a number of historians and scholars have shown, the class hierarchy in taste is deeply racialized, with Black culture continuously providing a source of artistic innovation from which both mass and avant-garde culture draws, but often whitewashing it in the process. For this reason, avant-garde dance forms cast its aesthetic in opposition. Avant-garde dance forms often cast their opposition to the commercial world of entertainment. When they do that, they can find themselves in a particularly contorted orientation to the Black culture from which that commercial world so frequently draws. If Black culture is always already commodified, then or commodifiable, right? Then a certain bad faith has always accompanied avant-garde attempts to distance itself from crass capitalism by distancing itself from Blackness. 20 Looks knows this anxiety intimately and makes clever use of it. The Vogue balls originated and thrive in other words, I'm saying that this, importing commercial and fashion values into an ostensibly postmodern avant-garde scenario is a deliberate tweaking of the class basis of the distance between avant-garde and mass. The Vogue balls originated and thrive in Black and Latin working class communities of the sex and gender nonconforming, and remain a vivid example of what Fred Moten has called the sentimental avant-garde, by which he means a popular, underground, and often criminalized space of utopian counterposition to the hegemonic order of an anti-Black, anti-queer, and misogynist world. They offer a space, They offer a space where quotidian violence, insecurity, poverty, and exploitation can be transformed into extravagant beauty and communitas. But they are also fierce, competitive, and saturated with shade. They present their sociality not as a permanent solution to the internecine violence of the world, but as a good enough space for bringing queer fantasy into tangible life. The power and allure of voguing and ballroom culture has itself presented a problem that both Harrell must deal with as a queer of color artist, reflecting upon traditions to which he does not exactly lay claim to. His work, that is to say, does not easily fit into either side of the straightforward polemic around appropriation. Elsewhere, I've attempted to theorize this sort of complex relationship between an artist or performer, or for that matter, a scholar or thinker, right, and a set of performance traditions that they might be identified with. It is a problem that, by comparison, Fred Moten recently names when he discusses his own relationship to hip-hop as follows, quote, "I don't engage with hip-hop so much as I emerge from it," unquote. What does it mean to have this relationship of emergence in relationship to a matrix of performance without necessarily performing it in a direct way? This is not the move of a post-Black artist distancing themselves from a vernacular, as much as it is the question of thinking with specificity and care about entanglement and virtuosity. There are multiple ways in which we, as a part of any given interpretive community, say the queer and trans of color community, can find ourselves entangled in a virtuosity like Vogue. The Vogue balls first came to public attention beyond the Black and Latin gay house community when, actually Madonna wasn't the first, but let's go with that for now, foreshortening history, right? When Madonna released her hit single Vogue in the 1990s, and Jenna Livingston's film, Paris is Burning, remains the single most viewed audiovisual document of the scene, despite various attempts to supplement, correct, and even replace it with new films. 20 Looks implicitly responds to the controversial questions raised by Madonna, Jenny Livingston, and others who took an interest in documenting, interpreting, or reperforming ball culture. Is that on the time slide there? But it does not do so by retreating into particularism, however, but through a strategic and often playful disruption of the norms that police which bodies appear where, under what conditions, and with what gestural vocabularies. Interesting. Maybe it'll appear on its own. The oft-commented upon whiteness of most of Harrell's dancers, other than himself, of course, is clearly an act of provocation, such an act of provocation. It is as if he were daring his audiences to lecture him as to who he can or cannot choreograph. In making their whiteness as visible, as starkly evident as possible, it's kind of funny to continue to hog the stage here. Eventually, in making their whiteness as starkly evident as possible, there you go, okay. Harrell denies it the naturalized status of normative ideal. His white male dancers, no less than he, have to work to strut their stuff in order to, there we go. His white male dancers, no less than he, have to work to strut their stuff in order to measure up in this alternate world of border crossing. This is another form of critical shade. It is a critical shading of white bodies and the audiences that privilege and prefer them as the embodiment of avant-garde and postmodern choreographic experimentation. 20 Looks does not skirt, but charges directly into the vexed questions that it raises. It asks whether the transgression of racial boundaries in expressive movement can ever be ethical, and has the courage not to impose a didactic answer to this quandary. Rather than moralize, Harrell remains playful, even defiant. As Madison Moore outlines in his illuminating studies of fierceness and fabulosity, minoritarian subjects often suffer debilitating imposter syndrome in elite white spaces, constantly second-guessing themselves as to whether they belong, have enough talent, or even whether the system that has preferred them individually is itself not structurally unjust. Harrell's critical shade confronts this imposter syndrome by generalizing it. Everyone is an imposter in his theatrical fantasias. The transgression of aesthetico-political boundaries proposed in 20 Looks, boundaries between black and white, gay and straight, haute couture and everyday dress, bohemian and urban ghetto, is a transgression that has preoccupied the imaginaries of many an artist, writer, and social reformer over the course of the 20th century. Rather than cast this fraught history as a trauma to be corrected by a future performance in which bodies bear only the expressive possibilities to which ascriptive race thinking demands, the proposition of 20 Looks contains what I call angular sociality. This is an edgy contact improvisation with and against the color line in art and aesthetics. Such performative angularity refuses to wish away racial difference in an impossible act of colorblindness, but it also de-dramatizes the alternate stance of structural antagonism that can produce dreams of a frictionless, color-coded sociality. Rather than retreat into a mythic blackness, however consoling, 20 Looks bears witness to the scenes of its own repeated travesty and seeks to locate spaces of affordance, intensity, and even joy therein. To say this is to note, if only in passing, that some skeptical critics have misconstrued the proposition made by 20 Looks as a conceptual ploy, one that furthermore it is the task of the critic to dispel. The partisans of pure movement see the importation of historical fabulation into the performance as an unfair stratagem that places a burden of proof on the critic or audience rather than the dancer or choreographer. These formalist critics would prefer to reinstate the burden of liveness and make the choreographer sing for his supper. In the face of such formalism, it becomes all the more important to, for instance, one critic, Charles O'Harrell's a very bad dancer, as if that were like a criteria, and then postmodern dance that you'd be able to like dance in some virtuosic way, right? In the face of such formalism, it becomes all the more important to vindicate the proposition, precisely along the same terms with which its critics seek to indict it. It is by opening the space of dance to the virtual and uneven intersection of historical forces that the proposition is afforded the possibility of finding or showing us something new. It makes the audience work, and work in new ways in the manner in which Roland Barthes described the writerly text as that which, in obliging the readers to work to create the meaning, creates a co-constitutive event. There is, in other words, an alchemy at work in the proposition for 20 Looks, within which the dance is obliged to betray its premises in order to fulfill them. An evening-length piece from the series entitled Antigone Senior exemplified this passionate attachment to history in its subjunctive and co-constitutive mood. At one level, a mashup between Sophoclean tragedy, Antigone, and the competitive categories of voguing ball culture, Antigone Senior never approached the play text through straightforward exposition. Instead, Sophoclean character and plot were employed more like a dress form around which a new performance could be draped. Unraveling to almost 3 hours in length, Antigone Senior redresses Greek tragedy through sequences of posing, stripping, and dressing up, singing and emoting that together manage to conjure with remarkable effectiveness the mood of an all-night ball, a form that is, for those of you who have attended them, characterized by periods of languor, disinterest, and fatigue in between unexpected clashes of electrifying intensity. Holding together all the strands and eccentric performances of this piece were two central ball categories, the king's speech and the mother of the house. An actual ball, of course, would feature a number of houses in competition. In Harrell's fictional archive, by contrast, there is only a single house, the House of Harrell. The mother of this house, however, is no dance mom of reality TV cliche, cruelly demanding movement virtuosity according to normative standards. Instead, she is a good enough mother in terms that the psychoanalytic theorist Winnicott uses. Like the good enough mother, she creates the performance space as a holding environment in which the children, as they're called in ball parlance, can act out scenes from the good enough life, in thus de-dramatizing the theatrical canon and taking these senior employees the form of a black queer culture to reshape the contents of postmodern dance's interest in everyday life. What is at stake for an artist such as Harold to draw upon ball culture as an influence at a time when the appropriation of black culture by both the avant-garde and popular culture is a frequent source of polemic? Appropriation, I would suggest, is an insufficient heuristic for grasping what is at stake politically in the transmission of artistic influence, insofar as it relies on a Platonic concept of ideal models versus fake copies. Appropriation critiques, I maintain, pay unintended homage to liberal ideologies of possessive individualism. They fail to reckon with the dispossessive force of performing objects. Of course, the critique of appropriation isn't a license to wholesale cultural theft, but its logics tend to founder whenever faced with the question of how to successfully define insiders from outsiders. It is precisely the trickster and boundary crosser who must be denied and defied in order to maintain the fictions of cultural purity. In making this argument, I am not endorsing appropriation so much as I am drawing upon Chambers-Letson's argument in his forthcoming book, After the Party, that, quote, the sensing subject's appropriation of the other, or of the objective external world, is never a totally individuated experience because it occurs through sense, unquote. Building upon a Marxist conception of the sensus communis, sensing in common, Chambers-Letson offers a more robust account of appropriation as that which tethers us together, that keeps us in entangled proximity, rather than that which consolidates individual rights within what Jody Melamed aptly calls neoliberal multiculturalism. If neoliberalism represents in order to destroy, as Melamed powerfully argues, then Chambers-Letson shows how the utopian work of minoritarian performance fabulates in order to save, bringing minoritarian subjects into a complex web of fabulationality. In conclusion, the trajectory from affect to sense that Trajal Harrell undertakes for us thus resonates with Judith Butler's recent articulation of the sense of expanse, which is not merely personal liberty, but collective movement. Reformulating her own prior work on the so-called ungrievable or unlivable life, Butler now notices in Munoz's work that within the, quote, within the very conviction that this is not a life, right, some sense of living and feeling becomes unexpectedly communicable across communities on the margins, or locked into minority status, or held under siege, and all too often defined by imprisonment and fatal abandonment, right? This is a link in some ways to like the Trisma, right? It's the very conviction that this is not a life worth living that produces this sense of community, of living in common, living otherwise. Harrell addresses these queer passions in a particularly poignant moment particular poignant moments during his queer fantasia of an avant-garde dance scene that has never actually existed, right? And perhaps can't even exist now. I refer here to the looks he gave over the course of performing, many more than 20 looks of anguish, effort, attraction, repulsion, interest, amazement, sadness, fatigue, grimace, seduction, surprise, care, concern, regret, dejection, incitement, lust, anger, side-eye, shade, signification, transport, triumph, pain, and abandon. These looks were performances in themselves and shared out an unshareable sorrow as well as a joy. In one sense, they could be seen as reactions offering the audience a clue to the dance's possible meanings. But in so modeling this auto-effective response to the dance story of erotic and euphoric entanglement, Harrell does not so much supplant the audience as he takes his place by their side, stalking the footlights of his own stage, sitting in his own audience, and breaking the presentational frame through a variety of other stratagems. Fabulation, in the end, in the philosophical tradition of Bergson and Deleuze upon which I have sought to draw, is most succinctly thought of as an impulse towards the virtual, The virtual is that which we are pulled towards precisely because it does not actually exist. Fabulation in this sense is not so much imagination as it is imagination's shadow. Stepping into the propositional mode of revised histories allows for the retrieval of abandoned practices and unspoken scenarios. Critical shade at its most generous provides a performer like Harrell a means to invent an alternative tradition within which to position his own dancing body, and in and through the same gesture, to mark out an impossible space for blackness and queerness in the contemporary dance and performance scene. By delving into the fraught dynamics of this zone of sexual and racial dissidence, Harrell's Afrofabulation inanimates the present with the past, making the lively arts of dance, story, and song a vehicle for virtual memory. That's it. Thanks. Thank you all. I think we have time for questions. Okay,
yes.
Great. So
yes.
People would like to ask any questions, comments.
I'll begin by saying that we need to kind of think through your argument. There's so much in there, and it's so articulate and at the same time complex that I think probably everyone is like thinking through it a little bit. So I will just perform the silence here and occupy it.
To say something that was interesting for me, that I think I've seen or I've heard kind of reflected in the spaces of speaking to students, which has to do with that, the idea of the, well, first off, I wanted to say, or ask about this term minoritarian, because I've thought it, I've heard it as, you know, somebody who has minority views or somebody who's from a kind of minority, even if it's a major minority community or whatever. So I was just wondering, like, kind of how you're using it, and sort of is this kind of you know, is this a terminology that, you know, I'm just wondering, like, should I be adopting this term? For one thing, and then the other question I had, what has to do was sort of the perspective that you laid out around the artist using, you know, white bodies specifically in their work, and how that sort of played out as critical, I thought was interesting. And I think that that is kind of a trap also for, you know, many artists around thinking through these racialized spaces and around what's allowable, what's not allowable, those kinds of issues.
I think those thank you. Those are two, I mean, I guess I'll take them as kind of interconnected, right, in some ways, right? Because the minoritarian, which is a term I very much draw from Munoz, is, I think I can sort of paraphrase the quote from Liz and Guattari. It's not speaking a minor tongue, it's speaking a major tongue in a minor way, right? That's sort of, it's making the majoritarian sphere shiver in its boots, right, in some way, right? You know, and it's with the implication that it is, you know, it is often, if not always, a kind of subtle mode that could be even overlooked, right? And its effects, its potential to reverberate is not always obvious or apparent in the way a kind of like a straightforward political negation of the majoritarian, you know, like would do, right? And so the attempt that I see in this particular, I should say not entirely, it's not like Charles O'Hara's like, I will only work with white dancers, that's not what I mean at all, right? But like the proposition is like, what if this one black dancer came into this predominantly white space, right? And took their assumptions about what everyday quotidian movement looked like, right? About a white normative conception of that movement, right? And redid it, right? Choreographically, right? that's the sort of scenario that he's imagining, and it's related to this gambit that somehow the minoritarian can do something within this hegemonic language that can undo it partly, right? Now, I could contrast this. I think it would be useful, right, to think about like two things. One, the ongoing participation of, say, actual Vogue houses in fashion and high art spaces, right? And also other choreographers who actually do use the ball children in their choreography, right? And in fact, probably it would be better talk if I somehow like placed all those possibilities side by side, so as not to create this sort of, I hope, like false impression that this is the only way to do this, right? It's just a particular way, and I think what it opens up for me is, there's a way in which Harold could quite easily claim to sort of occupy this space of Vogue by virtue of being a black queer choreographer, right? And he actually doesn't want to do that. He actually wants to kind of create a distance. He wants to be part of the audience, right? As well as the performer of this very angular and specific and competitive social dance form, right? So is that kind of, I obviously don't think no one should adopt any language that doesn't speak to that, right? But
that helped to clarify. Thank you.
And the last thing I would just, it's sort of been helpful for me in thinking through, I don't really develop it so much, but in the age of neoliberal multiculturalism, where we're kind of given these assigned identities, black and brown, Asian, we're supposed to occupy them and perform and represent them in a certain way in especially institutional spaces. The minoritarian for me always like kind of speaks to something that can't quite be, like it's not. It is a sharing out of the way in which these a kind of variety and actually not an open-ended series of sort of marginalized positions can resonate with each other, right? And that's important for me. He doesn't really get it in this part of the book that I read, but elsewhere in the book, I kind of try to go into that pretty intensively and think about resonances between, a kind of Latinx performer like Regina Jose Galindo and Kara Walker, right? Two very different scales. Nonetheless, a kind of resonance found through a kind of new materialism, a new materialist tactic of becoming stone. So that's what I'm going on. Yes?
I'm wondering if you could just kind of continue to speak about this question around a certain responsibility to history. So it's very engaging to think about a fictive archive, and kind of Afrofuturism does this as well, towards the future, but also somewhat towards the past by that kind of similar movement of imagination or invention. And I understand the critique that you clearly articulate about these models of truth, and it's very clear in Hartman's kind of expose of like the courthouse, and the fact that black subjects are not enabled to produce truth. But nonetheless, it seems to me that there is a responsibility to history. There is a responsibility to writing history. There is a responsibility towards the arc of justice, or whatever you want to call it that. And then I personally feel like, okay, how do we work towards strategies of empowerment in order to move towards that kind of horizon, against all of the forces that are lined up against us and getting stronger all the time. So certainly this is a really very kind of precise and inventive and very attuned strategy, but it operates on this heuristic level and on the level of relation to the audience and perception and But I guess I feel like there is a certain power, even if it is only momentary, and even if it is burdened by the burden of liveness, according to Munoz, of what happens in the voguing club, because it's awesome, you know, or like not from my own personal experience, but from kind of experience of groups,
it's
you know.
awesome.
And there is a empowerment that happens through that, that is different than a kind of depersonalized subject who would be playing all these positions, a more postmodern, let's say, stance. I'll just say it that way, even though the term is problematic. Of like being in the audience, breaking apart this these positions. So I'm just wondering if you could continue to speak about that.
Okay, I was with you until the very end, and so now I want to push back, but that's good. So it's good to get into it. So, okay, responsibility to history. I would say yes, but it's not that, let's say it's whose history, but it is, you know, sort of like history is perspectival, right, you know? And we know from like Benjamin and whatever, like the last thing we can ever rely upon is this idea of the past as it really was, right? So I know it's very bizarre to me. I've been working on it for a decade, it would be coming out in the age of Trump, right? Like I wake up with panic attacks all the time about like, I should withdraw this book from circulation, right? And the only way I can justify it is to make a really clear distinction between, you know, true lies and false lies, right? So like, there's a difference between a kind of false lie that is presenting itself as a truth, right? Like everything that comes out of the present regime's mouth, right? What happened last month, let alone a decade ago, right? And a kind of true lie, right? Which makes, you know, there's nothing, no one really should be able to mistake a fictional archive, right, with the truth, right? It's freely about invention, right? And it's in that inventiveness and that search for something in history that could never be pinned down, that the responsibility kind of begins. It doesn't really end there, right? So the responsibility is in this proposition that generates a kind of series of very different performances that, you know, never recreate the club. And that's where I want to push back a little bit, right? Because when you say, okay, so the club and the space of Vogue creates empowerment, right? I would agree. But I don't see that empowerment as contradicting this possibility of a postmodern or fragmented self, you know? I mean, like, voguing is all about, okay, now we're doing butch cleanup on the runway, right? You know, butch cleanup in pumps, right? Like, there's layers and layers and layers of highly, highly sophisticated posture and imposture in that form, right? And the problem that I see just as like a scholar, you know, is, as a participant, is that the trickiest thing comes when like the white cube or the art space or like the fashion gala, you know, wants to kind of like bring that energy in an uncomplicated way, right? You know, which Harold is definitely not going to do. Right? But what he will do is actually take some of the aesthetic strategies and ideas that he's learned from being a part, right? To take apart in a way almost kind of like an institutional critique of those art spaces, right? So the empowerment there is not the same, but it doesn't have to look the same or feel the same to have a kind of common root, right? You know, like, and that is sort of the intelligence I'm trying to, you know, bring out, while also admitting that it can misfire, it can fail, you know, it doesn't always succeed, right? And in some ways it also kind of runs its course, right? Like, he began doing this over a decade ago, right? And he stopped doing it. You know, he's like a different project right now, right? So it's not that it works forever, right? The other aspect of the minoritarian is that the majoritarian sphere catches on, right? And incorporates it even, right? Like, we know this from slang and from style, right? The very modes of empowerment that we kind of see and celebrate in like the undercommons, as it were, right? You know, are real and meaningful, right? But I don't think he necessarily wants to simply bring those into like the moment, right? Or even like the new museum. Is that?
Yes, definitely.
Yes.
I wanted to thank you for coming tonight, Crystal. I wanted to ask you, what do you think about the physical and mental changes of masculinity, since masculinity is far more effeminate now and is being promoted more within like homosexuality as far as like in the music scene and hip hop scene, since that started heavily as like an uplifting empowerment art field for musicians during that time, but now it's kind of like changed more as far as like an aesthetic style and like appealing more to a different generation. So I wanted to know your opinion since you made a few comments that are relevant.
My opinion about the physical and
Mental changes of Black masculinity.
changes. Okay. That's a very large question, you know. My opinion of that, I'm against them. No. Okay, so if you, there's a lot in my question, you know, like so. In part of your question, if I understand it correctly, you're pointing us to hip hop and popular culture, you know, so maybe thinking of like, so I'm sure I know you're talking about someone like a figure like Kanye West moving into the fashion space and designing clothes, right? I think that what, I don't know that Harold, I'll stick with the example that I brought into the room, right? That it is showing Black masculinity's, not as Black masculinity's capacity to change, right? But its basis in change, right? And I risk saying that because it seems now that we valorize change, right? You know, or like plasticity as a good in itself, right? Because it, you know, the capacity for Blackness and Black masculinity to change under the duress of the contemporary moment is a sign of resilience or something, you know, but also commercial, you know, and then we might think in a certain way that kind of, you know, Blackness that doesn't change, that kind of stays, you know, the same, right, would somehow like maybe resist the contemporary, you know, spectacle, right? I think, of course, as your question is alluding, it's more complicated than that, right? And we both need, it sounds like a cop-out, but both change and, you know, and continuity, right? We need a changing same, as it were, right? And so for me, elsewhere in the project, I make a bid, which I hope will succeed and may not, to recover the masculinity, the Black masculinity of Sweetback. Actually, as a kind of queer and trans masculinity, right? You know, and what I say about that film, which is very often, I mean, beginning when it first was released in the 70s, it was kind of criticized for its kind of male chauvinist and misogynist portrayals of women, right? But also of Sweetback as a kind of revolutionary figure, right? That there are ways of placing that film alongside the aesthetic experiments of Adrian Piper, right? Who develops her character mythic being according to her own music, you know, according to her notebooks, right? While like in the subway looking at sexploitation and blaxploitation images, right? That's the kind of genesis for her proposition, right? And so she produces a certain kind of masculinity that is part of this changing same. So, you know, Black male effeminacy didn't arrive in this country. You know, it's been around, right? You know, like, and we can see it in the Sweet Man of the Blues. We can see it in Jerry Roll Morton. We can see it in if you look at the work of C. Riley Norton, there's a whole racial history of trans performance in the 19th century, right? These are aspects and elements of the angularity of Black culture, right? It's not a new thing, but it may be newly commodifiable or newly spectacularized in a certain way that we have to think about. Yeah. Does that answer?
Yeah.
Yes.
I didn't know if my questions like fully formed. Luckily, I got you for class tomorrow. So.
Okay, great.
But like some of the like in Paris and Burn, Latinos and the overview of Blackness, like how do they then fall in the movement? Like, are they then, you know, because of like what happened with like the Caribbeans and how there's more diaspora, even though there's not, you know, like African descent, you know, in like Cuba and the Dominican and Puerto Rico, right? So there's more Afro-Latinos, and then like we saw like people who look Black, you know, but they have you know, Latin names. So I'm wondering, in your writings and within the houses, you know, are they, you know, identified as Black, and are they within the Black, you know, identity, or are they then pushed to the Latin identity? I mean, I read a lot of theory, and like there's like people who say like, you know, my name's like, you know, something Latin, but I consider myself Black, you know? So like, I'm just wondering how in your book, you know, is this reconciled? Somebody who, you know, is of Latin descent, but, you know, identifies as Black, and where is this falling in terms of like Black identity? Mm-hmm. You know, because I felt like that was a big identity in the East Coast when I was going to school there. You know, whether like people having to choose identity when it's like actually on both.
Thank you. That's it's a complex and difficult question, and again, I don't know that I'll have a really satisfactory answer for any one person, right? Because in some ways you're asking a kind of highly kind of empirical question, right, about what is it like to live Blackness and brownness as ways of being in the world, as identities, in relation to other people, right? You know, and it's different on the East Coast and the West Coast, and it's different with, you know, it's different in Queens than it would be, you know, in Manhattan, and it's also contextually different, right? We have all of us carry, you know, identities in the plural, right? And we voice some in some contexts and some in other contexts, right? It's not necessarily anything postmodern. It's just being a minority person, something in the world that you have multiple identities, right? That said, I think kind of one thing I want to kind of clarify is that my project is definitely not in any way intended to be an ethnography or a comprehensive account of the ball culture. I would actually point elsewhere, so I would point to the work of like Marlon Bailey, who has done a really interesting study of the ball scene actually in Detroit, Michigan. So you had another place, right, what it looks like, you know, in the Midwest, where you have Blackness and brownness, but the actual demographically, the demographics of brownness in the greater Detroit area actually tilt very much more to sort of people of Middle Eastern descent, right? You know, and how that then reconfigures what, you know. But the best I can do with the answer is to say that, you know, the form of the balls, which are these sort of competitive and house-based forms, sort of allow people to, you know, participate by offering a. Actually, I'll answer your story with an anecdote, right? So, I was in Berlin, and there was a group of predominantly white dancers who were trying to start a ball scene there, right? And it was, I think, literally like the House of Estonia was in the house, right? Like brought like some, you know, and you would think, okay, so this is very, very far from like a queer of color experience, right? And in fact, I was like in the audience watching a dancer who was like pretty appalled, let's say, at the performance skill, you know. But there was in this sort of good enough, you know, it's not the thing that I always push back a little against this idea that like ball and house culture is completely outside of any kind of European influence, right? You know, it's called, you know, like, or it's not untouched. It's actually intensifying that touch, right? It really wants to insist upon the terrible power actually of like Paris, right, or Estonia or whatever, right? You know, and bringing that into a space in which Europeans or people from Asia are participating in these forms, right? Again, it's very outside my own expertise. I wouldn't claim to have like deep intimate knowledge of what that looks like, you know, but I will say that form does allow for it, right, or create an opportunity for everyone getting an opportunity to shine in some way, right? And in some ways that might be one of its weaknesses, right? Like there's a kind of vulnerability to the radical accessibility of certain Black and minoritarian forms. Sean Crawley writes very beautifully about this in Pentecostal Breath, where he kind of tries to, it's a difficult thing, where he valorizes precisely the openness of the Black church to the white supremacist shooter, right? Like as the site of his Blackness. The fact that it's actually vulnerable, it's open even to him, right? And if it weren't, it would be something different, right? You know, it would be the Black church, right? So that kind of, it's, you know, it's not only a good thing that our spaces and rituals and cultural forms are open to, you know, even those with hostile intent, right? It's not always a good thing, but it is a thing. It is part of the axiology of the culture. Yes?
Thank you so much for that. There's a lot there, like a lot of kind of richness there. I'm thinking about imagination, shadow, and the angular sociality, and especially how that might like butt up against what kind of Nora was saying, like the arc of justice, or you know whatever, right? So like,
how is that arc of justice doing? Right?
I know, or where it touches it, or you know whatever. But I actually have a question. I actually have a question about the kind of costuming of the piece, and something that you mentioned early on, which is that the entire kind of array of costuming remains visible throughout the work.
By and large, yeah.
Yeah. And some of the stills that you showed, and I don't know where they are, but some of the stills that you showed have Trujal wearing these kind of highlighter gloves, like these kind of
that's
these
right,
kind of ways of kind of enunciating kind of various parts of the body. Can you kind of bring the costuming to bear into your argument a little bit more, because it's so evocative, you know, like in what it's doing on the stage, and I'm curious as to how it kind of plays a role and whether he developed that or whether someone else kind of developed it.
Yeah, I know for sure.
Thank you.
Developed it. Thank you for that. I mean, it sounds like you probably have more to say on than I do, because I, you know, I don't know that much about fashion, to be perfectly honest. So it's a hard, you know, or design, costume design. What I want to say about this both is it's sort of like I memo to myself to kind of do kind of more future research. How it relates to imagination's shadow.
Yeah.
It's very much attached in, well, the first and most obvious thing would be to say is that it's highly intentional. Like pretty much every piece that he wears or that others wear, he has like collected in some way, and he has like a relationship to the process by which haute couture or even just everyday, you know, clothing is sort of, you know, it's like the fashion system, right? It's like a terrible, ubiquitous system, right? And he builds some of the performances. It's a better question actually for him, actually.
Okay.
You know, like
sure.
out of the costumes, you know, you know, yeah, the highlighter gloves and you know, I think here, I guess because you see him sort of kind of posing as a couturier, you know, someone who's sort of dressing, directing, that's not him, right? Directing, but also performing. He's like singing, you know, he often does like stand up, you know, he's sort of blurring the lines because you can't even see that. Okay, never mind. He's, I don't know how to say it's just not in any way like any fashion show you've ever been to. Not that I've been to a lot of fashion shows, right? But it doesn't satisfy the desire for like instantly consumable images that can kind of circulate around the world. You know, like what fashion is supposed to do, right? It doesn't do that, right? But it does that by using the materials of fashion, right? So you'll take a piece that is not fashionable, right? You know, but was fashionable, like, you know, and bring it into this kind of impossible juxtaposition or assemblage in the present. That's, I think, maybe the best I can say about that at this point. But it's a good question to ask Tropical Hero. So invite him to come and lecture about like his relationship, you know, to, and the last thing I'll say is that, you know, there's a whole thing on his relationship to Japanese avant-garde fashion and choreography and aesthetics that it appears more and more over the course of 20 looks, but even, but now in subsequent work he's done. And that clearly has a direct lineage, you know, like maybe that gives me one more thing to say, that if postmodern dance was kind of in a no doubt reductive way about removing the costume and just dancing or being on stage in like everyday clothes, like what his relationship to, like his own relationship to fashion, but also his engagement with designers like Comme des Garçons, and just to sort of like, yeah, like, it's questioning what the everyday looks like. You know, like who's everyday, right? You know, and deconstructing a certain kind of white normativity of what quotidian, everyday, or unspectacular movement or dress looks like, right? And I think that is, yeah, that is an important element of the work.
Thank you.
Yes.
I guess, do you see the way that he uses this like fictional, or creating this like fictive archive as being a way of kind of rewriting the past in a way that I guess like some other artists do it through maybe conventional mediums? And then I guess follow up with that would be like, what's like the significance of doing that through performance in this kind of ephemeral medium, I guess?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think there's obviously links to like what we brought and the Atlas Archive. You know, it's funny though when you say that though, because when I first learned, I was in the process of working on this book. When I first learned that he was describing what he was doing as fictional archiving, I would be kind of like mad. I was like, wait, you're stealing our thunder as scholars. We're supposed to be doing the archive, right? And then, but then I was sort of like, so where is this archive that you're talking about, right? Like, you're basically engaged in a compositional practice, a choreographic practice. You're calling it fictional archiving, right? But where's the archive, right? Part of the answer goes back to the first question that's before, like the clothing is part of the archive, right? How he animates this collection of fashion, couture, not only couture, you know. And part of it is, I think now, sort of, even in these kind of presentations, talks in the book, I'm trying to get at is sort of the archive of images and memories and other sort of like ephemera of the performances, right? So to answer your question about why do this in the context of you know, performance, if something like, you know, Trio A or The Mind is a Muscle, there's something about this documentation that we're looking at here, which is it can be almost accidental. You know, you can almost imagine people, maybe not, you know, being unaware or unconcerned, or you know, maybe that's problematic. You know, but it does seem that the photograph is very different than a contemporary moment where it's just ubiquitous photography, right? You know, and even the way we move, right, is, you know, we're always ready for the Instagram, right? You know, and so what it means to, you know, how to actually create a space of sort of intimacy and specificity in a performance without any aspiration to not go undocumented, right? So part of the fiction, I'm just actually thinking about this as you ask that question, right? Like part of the fiction is dissimulation in the present, right? It's like knowing that, you know, you only do so much to keep cameras out of any given performance, right? But you can kind of create a proposition that sort of makes it hard to sort of, you know, deliberately reconstruct what was happening, right? And that seems to be least part of his project, or part of what I'm picking up on, and which other artists I think are as well. I don't know if that's a very good answer, but I'm going to ask a follow-up. Any other questions, comments? You turn the lights back on, it's making us sleepy. It's like cocktail hour.